Hey guys, this is Max and welcome to another episode of Analog Insights. In today's episode, Jules and I will review the Olympus OM-4 Ti, which represents the highest evolution in the OM system. And it is quite a contrast to the Olympus OM-1 that we've recently reviewed, and you might have seen the review. That was very basic and does not feature any advanced electronics. And the OM-4 Ti, in contrast, comes with a multi-spot metering system that makes it possible to average 8 different spot meterings together, and has an electronically controlled shutter that goes up to 1/2000th of a second. We've tested this camera extensively in the last couple of months, doing photo walks in Augsburg and Salzburg, and I did 2 different portrait sessions with it, one in Salzburg where Jules accompanied me and another one in Munich, incidentally with the very same model Leia. So let's take a look at all the photographs that we took, and I try to provide you with all the information necessary about this camera. The Olympus OM-4 Ti was first introduced in 1986 and was sold until 2002. So for quite a long time. And 2002 also marked the 30th anniversary of the OM system, and unfortunately also the last year that this system or any camera in the system was produced. Nevertheless, by that time, the OM system lived up to its promise and design philosophy, which was from cosmos to bacteria, so that you can take a photograph with it anytime and anywhere, basically, as the legendary designer Yoshihisa Maitani explained in an interview. And you can really see that by the market that it had hit, because astronomers used it, biologists used it, but also a lot of professional photographers. And when that particular camera, the Olympus OM-4 Ti, hit the market, it was really directed at professionals and, one could say, advanced, ambitious amateurs, so what we today would probably call prosumers. And you could see that by the relatively high price that it had. It was an expensive piece of equipment, and it was also marketed accordingly. And probably the most important marketing feat that Olympus pulled off was to have it featured in the introduction of the 1989 James Bond movie, A License to Kill. So the message was basically, if James Bond uses it, you might want to use it as well. So now let's talk about the features of the OM-4 Ti. Most importantly, its very advanced metering system. Because the OM-4 was the very first camera that came with a built-in multi-spot exposure meter that let you take up to 8 different spot measurements and average them out automatically. So how would that work? You basically have a little lever around the shutter release, and with that you can take a measurement and put that into the camera memory. And you can do that up to 8 times and would average them out. And in addition to that, you also have a shadow and a highlight button on the camera that lets you indicate what is the darkest area of the image, so basically black ideally, and what is the lightest part of the image, so typically white. And you could use these buttons to indicate that information to the light meter, and it would take that into account for its readings. And what I personally really like is that the reading is indicated in a graduated linear LCD display at the bottom of the viewfinder that really feels a lot like the late 80s and early 90s. And personally, I always was reminded of Michael Knight with his car Kid that was almost about to speak to him because of that red LCD indication that you have at the bottom of the viewfinder. So pretty nice, and it works really, really great, and in our tests it never failed us. It was rather that I had sometimes a hard time remembering in which direction to pull that lever in order to put something into the memory, in order to clear that memory. That's something that you have to get used to, and I found myself often looking at the camera again and kind of figuring out which way it was, because of course it's indicated there, but kind of the muscle memory, it took some time to get going. But especially for portraits, especially also if you take images against the light, it works really, really great. So the Olympus OM-4 Ti came with an electronically controlled horizontal cloth focal plane shutter with speeds ranging from 1 second to 1/2000th of a second plus the usual bulb mode. Unfortunately, that electronically controlled shutter was also battery dependent, so once you're running out of battery, all that is left is a mechanical shutter with only one speed, that is 1/60th of a second. But that was also quite common. Most importantly, with respect to the shutter and all that and the advanced electronics, for the very first time, Olympus introduced full flash synchronization from speeds ranging from 1/60th of a second up to 1/2000th of a second. So how did that work? Because there's typically one very important problem about such a focal plane shutter. Because the way it works is it consists of 2 different curtains. And basically these are only open completely across the entire film plane at 1/60th of a second. Any faster shutter speed means that you basically have the second curtain close faster after the first curtain opened. So you basically have a slit moving across the film plane and exposing the film accordingly at faster shutter speeds. And once you bring in the idea of a flash that typically pulses for 1 millisecond, you instantly realize, okay, that's a problem, because it would only expose the particular slit that is open at that moment of time where the flash goes off. And of course, only that part of the film would be exposed correctly. So what do you do about that, and how do you proceed? Basically, Olympus introduced the Olympus F280 full synchro flash that brings a continuously pulse of light for 40 milliseconds, which enabled the slit to expose the film correctly through that continuous pulse of light, even up to speeds of 1/2000th of a second. And due to the advanced electronics and that the OM-4 Ti could speak to that flash perfectly, that was suddenly possible. And that was a major innovation at the time, to have flash synchronization from speeds of 1/60th of a second up to 1/2000th of a second, because of course that opens up possibilities as well. Another thing that I want to mention is its high build quality and that it is weather sealed. And I came across an interesting article that I just want to point out too, and that I'm also linking in the description below, that quotes from a German magazine test from 1989 of that particular camera, which was really tortured and basically put into a freezer at -20 degrees for 8 hours, and then right afterwards put into an oven, and then into a wind channel where it was blasted with dust and things like that. And the result of all these tests were that afterwards it had only some very limited functionality problems, sometimes just temporarily. So it could really live up to its promise of being capable of accompanying a professional photographer not only in the desert but also in a very cold environment, and even instantly afterwards that was possible. And speaking of the market that the camera addresses, it is very interesting to note that this camera kind of missed its market to some extent, because it was introduced right after the landmark Minolta Maxxum 7000, which was a camera with autofocus capabilities. And that was something completely innovative and new at the time. And one can really say by the late 1980s, so by 1989, there were hardly any manual focus SLR 35mm SLR cameras on the market, because most of the major manufacturers had tried to invest heavily into autofocus capabilities and tried hard to bring that not only to amateurs but also to professional photographers and convince them that this is needed. And it is interesting that Olympus was kind of locked into the OM system, where they could not add this additional capability to their mount system and integrate that into future lens systems and so forth. So they had to stick to manual focus lenses and a manual focus system, and nevertheless managed to market their cameras, probably also just because of that great build quality, to professional photographers and also to traditionalist enthusiasts who didn't mind not having autofocus, and especially with respect to the professionals who actually enjoyed or wanted to use manual focus instead. So I personally found it interesting that it was possible to sell these cameras even up until 2002, despite the fact that it already had missed its market early on. And yeah, and to pull that off, basically, that was interesting. So you see us using the cameras here for photo walks and portrait sessions, and I personally really enjoyed using it. I like the classic design. I appreciate that it is weather sealed. I like its really compact form factor. But nevertheless, in terms of ergonomics, I find that there's quite a lot going on, especially on the top plate. If you compare it to the OM1 that I liked so much because of its simplicity, there's really a lot going on. And even as I mentioned before, memorizing where to put the lever when you want to memorize a reading and how to delete that and clear the space again. This, to me, felt like a little hurdle, and I had to overcome that. And I even had to overcome it again when I didn't pick up the camera for 1 or 2 months and then used it for another portrait session. Which is, I think, to some extent quite common for such advanced electronically controlled cameras, but I'm just not really used to that. So it took me some time, but overall, once I got used to it, I really liked it, and I saw the benefit in using such a camera for portrait sessions where you might have difficult light situations and you just want to get your exposure right, and that was really helpful. The only thing I didn't like here with respect to the advanced metering system is the nervous beep sounds that it makes when it would potentially overexpose the film. So if you're just shooting at wide open apertures and having the lens cap off and then direct the camera towards the sky, it would instantly start to beep because it would be too bright for it, and that I personally found that quite annoying. And it was particularly difficult during portrait sessions when it started to beep there when I was actually directing my camera at my model and the camera was telling me you're about to overexpose. Even in situations where I potentially wanted to do that. So, for example, when I shoot some Kodak Portra, as some of you will do as well, you sometimes want to overexpose. And of course, that was kind of a tricky thing on my part. I just could have changed the settings. So basically reduce the ISO in order to get the overexposure. And here I just found that interesting that the camera kind of can actually destroy a very intimate situation between you as a photographer and the model just because of that nervous electronic beep sound. So that's one little downside that I personally found. here you can see a portrait that I took of Leia in Salzburg that was shot with a 135mm f2.8 portrait lens, and this one was shot wide open, so at f2.8, and in my opinion it's incredibly sharp and comes with a beautiful bokeh, and I wanted to use that opportunity to talk quickly about the OM lenses, so the Zuiko lenses that the OM system brings about. What is interesting to note here is that the OM bayonet comes with a very large diameter, and at the same time the lenses are rather compact compared to other brands. And what I personally found interesting is that Olympus always offers the same lens grading for all its different lenses, despite regardless of whether these lenses are directed at, let's say, consumers or really professionals. So for example, the 50mm lens came in 3 different versions. You had an f1.8 lens, and that was directed at amateurs, an f1.4 lens that was directed at, let's say, prosumers or professionals who were fine with f1.4, and then there was a much more expensive f1.2 lens, so giving you a little bit more light, that was directed at professionals, but all came with the same lens grading. So Olympus did not differentiate through grading, but rather by the widest aperture. And speaking of wide apertures, what I personally also found quite interesting is that Olympus really had a strong focus at f2 lenses. And at the height of the success of the camera system, they were the only ones. They had the largest set of f2 lenses of any camera manufacturer or camera system ever before. So really ranging from an f2 macro lens to telephoto prime lenses, also at f2, even up to 250mm. And that is really impressive. And reading an interview with Yoshihisa Maitani, again, the legendary designer behind the OM system, you could also see that he was personally very fond of these f2 lenses and had all sorts of wide angle primes at 24mm, at 28mm, using these a lot, and also appreciating having f2 across an entire setup of equipment and lenses. So this is important to point out, because these lenses, of course, are not really cheap, but can be had for relatively little money, especially if you compare them to, let's say, Leica lenses or some other brands as well. The only thing that I personally found unfortunate is if you look at the Salzburg portraits that I took, I had to take some of them with a relatively slow film, an ISO 100 film, during a wintry day when we did not have a lot of light available. And I had shutter speeds ranging from 60s of a second to 1/90s of a second, something like that, and had to open my aperture completely. So I was shooting at f1.4 with a 50mm lens, and here, in my opinion, the bokeh did not turn out beautiful. So it is very swirly, taking a lot of attention, and also the sharpness was not really convincing in my opinion. So I tried hard to focus correctly and hit and nail focus, and even when I did, so first and foremost, it was very difficult, but even when I did, I feel like these areas of the image did not really come out quite sharp, and you lose a lot of corner sharpness with that particular lens, and I found that unfortunate. But in contrast, the 135mm lens really surprised me, and I really like the images that came out of that lens, even shot wide open at f2.8. So what is the bottom line, and would we recommend buying this camera? If you are looking for a small, light, electronically advanced 35mm SLR camera with a classic design, then it's a definite yes, go for it. It does feature an amazing multi-spot exposure meter. It comes with access to great Zuiko lenses, and it is a lot of fun to use due to its compact size and really great build quality. As mentioned before, I only see these little downsides, like, okay, there's a lot going on the top plate in terms of buttons, but once you get around you hang around it and know how to use it. It's actually a lot of fun and makes sense. And personally, I didn't like the beeping sound that warned me of potential overexposure. But apart from that, it's really a great camera. The only thing that you should of course be aware of is that it does not feature autofocus. So if you want to invest in a system with autofocus lenses, this is not the one to go for. But if you're fine with manual focus, then you should definitely take a look at the OM system. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed our review of the Olympus OM-4 Ti. If you did, please remember to like this video and maybe even share it with your friends. As always, we really appreciate your comments in the comment section below and are looking forward to them. And also, we would also appreciate it if you subscribe to our little channel. Jules and I get really excited about each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.